Well, this is where we are finally come again, because Boy Lecture Series, the Boy Distinguished Lecture Series, is something that we try to organize every month, and it has come to a lot of good reception. It has also come to a lot of good applause from people, a lot of support from people, and our distinguished lectures, distinguished presenters, whether it's Catherine Malibu or Tom Mitchell and now Marjorie Perloff, they have been so supportive, so warm, and so hearty about this program. Here we begin this third Boy Lecture Distinguished Series, and Boy. Now, why Boy? As you can see behind in the poster, why Boy? Now, Boy is the Bangla word for book, and it is also, I must say in an aside, a word for cinema in Bangla. It points to early Bengali cinema's dependence on the book for its stories. Now, when we, by which I mean the Department of English, University of North Bengal, began discussing the possibility of organizing a lecture series that could bring the world to a small town in Bengal, we began with ideas and metaphors. And at one point, both came together. The world that had traveled to places like ours through books, and it is through books that we made our first international travels. What better than Boy, the book then, to commemorate that heritage of old travel, the link it to our new travels on the internet. Now, like the pages of a boy, where writer meets reader, this lecture series will be a meeting place for the reader and the writer. The featured author will speak about one of their books and in the process introduce us to their mind and the context that have produced it. We will announce the title of the book in advance, as we have always done, so that interested readers can get acquainted with the boy that will be discussed by its author. This will allow for an engaged discussion about the author's talk, and since I'm on the subject already, this is how we are actually planning the program today. Marjorie will speak for an hour, and after that, there will be half an hour, the discussion around the featured book. And all of you can type your questions in comments, and our team will collect them to ask the author after their talk. While we hope that our students learn to articulate their thoughts as they see these fascinating minds at work, I hope the Boy Lecture Series, which will feature books that have impacted the field and changed the humanities, will also be of interest to anyone who has picked up a book and looked at it with wonder, imagining how it came to be. Now, welcome to the third distinguished lecture under the Boy Lecture Series that we formally inaugurated on 20th January this year with Catherine Malibu. Our distinguished speaker today is Marjorie Perloff, who doesn't need an introduction for anyone interested in poetry and criticism. For Perloff is one of the finest critics of poetry, poetics, and literary criticism and theory of our generation. Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, Perloff has done much to promote poetics that are not normally part of the discourse in the United States, such as works of Zuforsky, Kenneth Goldsmith, or Brazilian poetry. She's credited with coining the term unoriginal genius, this is the name of a book that she wrote, to reflect on the changing nature of literary writing, including poetry, in the internet age, after artistic originality and creativity are allegedly replaced by the ability to pass along information. Her work on contemporary American poetry and in particular poetry associated with the avant-garde, such as language poetry and the objectivist poets, has significantly opened up the official verse culture to critique and dialogue from outside the classroom and lecture hall. Even as poetry in the United States today continues its division between categories like experimental, mainstream, and spoken word. Among her many books, I think 13 that she wrote so far, I would like to name a few. Poetics in a New Key, Interviews and Essays, Chicago Press, 2014. Unoriginal Genius is the book I was talking about. Poetry by Other Means in the New Century, Chicago Press, 2010. Differentials, a major book by Marjorie. Differentials, Poetry, Poetics, Pedagogy, University of Alabama Press. Now this went on to win the Robert Penn Warren Prize for Literary Criticism in 2005, as well as the honorable mention for the Robert Motherwell Prize of the Douglas Foundation. She wrote The Futurist Moment for Chicago Press, 2003, Poetry on and Off the Page, Essays for Emergent Occasions from the Northwestern Press, 1998, Frank O'Hara, Poets Among Painters, University of Chicago Press, The Dance of the Intellect, Studies in the Poetry of the Pound Tradition, from Northwestern University Press, and this is one of my favorite books which I'm to mention now, Wittgenstein's The Ladder, Poetic Language and the Strangeness of the Ordinary, from Chicago Press, 1996, and Radical Artifice, Writing Poetry in the Age of Media, that also from Chicago Press in 1991, and not to forget her cultural memoir, The Vienna Paradox, which was published in 2004 and has been widely discussed so far. So on behalf of all of us here, we welcome Marjorie Perloff for the third Bowie Distinguished Lecture. Before we begin and we hand it over to Marjorie to begin her presentation, we first like to show you the cover of the book, The Bowie in Focus.
Very nice, yeah. Okay. Shall I start?
Yes, yes, Marjorie. Now you can start your presentation. Welcome.
Okay, and somebody will do the slide. Thank you so much, Ranjan, for this beautiful introduction. Much too kind. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I could really be there on Zoom, but on the other hand, I probably couldn't be. So it's wonderful to do it on Zoom. Can you all see me? Hear me? Yes? Everybody? I hope so.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ranjan. Okay, so I'm really happy today to be presenting. I have two books coming out, actually. One is going to be the notebooks, the unpublished notebooks of Wittgenstein, which I'm working on finishing up now. And they go together, you'll see, in certain ways. But I'm delighted to be trying out the first chapter, which I'll read you, not quite the whole chapter, and then a little bit of another chapter to make the point of my new book, Infrathin, and you're probably wondering what that word means. I'll start, if I may have the first slide, with an epigraph. Can we have the slide? Yes? Hello?
Yes, Marjorie, we're putting this first slide down. Just a second.
Okay, I just waiting. No problem. Okay, and so the next one. Yeah, the next one. Right after that.
The next slide.
Yes, very good. Okay, these are just my aphorisms. Hegel, this is from Wittgenstein, seems to me to be wanting to say that things which look different are really the same, whereas my interest is in showing that things which look the same are really different. That's what this paper is about in terms of poetry. I have a second epigraph that I didn't put on the page here from Viktor Shklovsky, the Russian. A change feature in the similar can change the entire system by its dissimilarity. Now, the impetus for writing this book was an invitation I received in 2017 from Ronald Shouchard. Some of you may know him, the director of the London T.S. Eliot Summer School. Maybe some of you have been to that summer school. I don't know. To give, I was asked to give the annual address at Little Gidding on the fourth of the four quartets, which bears that title, Little Gidding, for the church and the actual town in England. I've long loved Eliot's earlier poetry, but the four quartets always struck me as too contrived in their exposition of Christian doctrine. They don't really speak to me personally that much. And yet I had to admit that Little Gidding contains some of Eliot's most striking and memorable lines and phrases, like "to purify the dialect of the tribe," that became very famous, or "the conscious impotence of rage," phrases that took on a life of their own, and many became book or film titles. It's amazing how many titles T.S. Eliot supplied. Still, such high points could hardly account for the continuing popularity of the four quartets. Now, much has been made of the musical structure of the quartets, which has been found to resemble the four-part structure of specific quartets by composers like Beethoven or Bartok. But such considerations of external form, it struck me, hardly got to the heart of the matter. Other poets, after all, wrote fugues, quartets, and so on, and never quite caught the audience's fancy, as has Eliot's sequence. Now, is the appeal related to distinctive imagery? I don't think so, because the poem's predominantly Christian symbolism, from the rose garden of Burnt Norton to the refining fire of Little Gidding, is rather less original and memorable than, say, the conceit of the evening sky as a patient etherized upon a table from the early love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which I will come back to later. It's, I would submit, at the micro level that the brilliance of Little Gidding manifests itself. As an examination of the revisions bears out, every phoneme, every morpheme, every word, phrase, rhythm, and syntactic contour has been chosen with an eye to creating a brilliant verbal, visual, and sound structure. Etymology and homology also play a central role, so that everything in the poem relates to everything else in surprising and remarkable ways. Now, in charting the poem's micropoetics, I was especially aware of what Marcel Duchamp, to me, who was the great artist, visual artist of the 20th century, more than Picasso, more influential anyway, in many ways, what Duchamp referred to in his later notebooks as the infra-thin, and the French word is infra-mass, the infra-mass. In his famous notes on the subject, Duchamp declares with his characteristic irony that one cannot define the infra-thin, one can only give examples of it. That again sounds like Wittgenstein, who always said, I can't define the language game, I can only give you examples. There isn't one definition. Now, next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. Some of Duchamp's examples are playful. For example, the warmth of a seat which has just been left behind is infra-thin. Sliding doors of the metro, the people who pass through at the very last moment, infra-thin. This next one is clearer. Velvet trousers, their whistling sound and walking by brushing of the two legs is an infra-thin separation signaled by sound. When the tobacco smoke smells also of the mouth which exhales it, the two orders marry by infra-thin. These are comic in many ways. The infra-thin separation between the detonation noise of a gun, very close, and the apparition of the bullet hole in the target. Next slide. The difference between the contact water and molten lead make with the walls of a given container is infra-thin. I'm sorry, there's one above that too that doesn't show up here. In time, the same object is not the same after a 1 second interval. So it's temporal, not just spatial, but temporal. Others raise larger issues about time, space, and especially language. So we get things like, the difference between the contact water and molten lead make with the walls of a given container is infra-thin. Two men are not an example of identity, and on the contrary, diverge with an infra-thin difference that can be evaluated. It would be better to go into the infra-thin interval, which separates two identicals, than to conveniently accept the verbal generalization, which makes two twins look like two drops of water. And that's an interesting one. You know, obviously, we all know what twins are, but twins aren't completely the same. Even identical twins, there will be certain differences, even if tiny ones. And then finally, the difference dimensional between two objects in a series made from the same mold is an infra-thin one when the maximum of precision is attained. So if you would have a mold, let's say with some kind of pudding in it, by the time you finish, they would actually not be exactly the same. So the case in each of these examples is made for difference, however minute, between an A and a B. Adjectives are not equivalent to nouns and shouldn't be used as such, even though, you know, we shift all the time. The singular is not the plural. The present tense is not the past. A second long interval can be a decisive one. And perhaps most importantly, even two objects made from the same mold are not, in fact, identical. Now, that last definition recalls Wittgenstein's question in the Philosophical Investigations, but isn't the same at least the same? Isn't the same at least the same? The answer for Wittgenstein as for Duchamp is always no. However minuscule the difference between one word or phrase or statement and another, the difference, as Gertrude Stein put it in Tender Buttons, is spreading. And Stein shows us this endlessly in her wonderful prose. The slightest repetition or shift in context changes the valence and meaning of any word or word group. So if I say a rose is a rose is a rose, by the time I get to that third rose, it's already a little bit different because you perceive it differently and you watch me differently, whatever it is. As the notice theorist of rhythm Henri Mesternick put it with regard to music, a repeated phrase is never the same phrase as any of the previous instances, precisely because they've already been heard, and the listener, by having already heard them, is different. Now, Duchamp's short and often enigmatic maxims that you have here and elsewhere are always a shade tongue-in-cheek, comic. He tells us that infra-thin cannot be a concept. The word can only be exemplified, but of course his witty examples do add up to a concept. Moreover, Duchamp knows only too well that he is exaggerating, but exaggerating seems necessary at a time when it would seem generalization, and especially the generalizations of the social sciences, the media of political discourse, have prevailed over any other discourse. And if the generalizing habit was already prominent in the 1930s when Duchamp wrote his infra-thin notes, think of what it's like 100 years later. I took down, I'm not going to put it on a slide, I don't want to be mean, but I took down when he gave it Joe Biden, President Biden's inaugural address. And I'll just read you a few statements, and it's not characteristic only of Biden. You get this in every political address, so just listen for a minute. To make progress, we must stop treating our opponents as our enemy, he said. We are not enemies, we are Americans. Well, now what kind of a statement is that? What do you mean? We're not enemies, we're Americans. Americans can't be enemies? You know what he's trying to say, but it's very silly. Next one. The plan will be built on a bedrock of science. The way the word science has recently been misused in the discussion about COVID is not to be believed. Science is just sort of this word. The plan will be built on a bedrock of science. It will be constructed out of compassion, empathy, and concern. I didn't know that. I thought science was supposed to be neutral. So what does that mean? Compassion, empathy, and concern. And then finally this one, and now together on eagle's wings, we embark on the work that God and history have called upon us to do. Eagle's wings is a total cliche. Eagle's wings, what do you mean eagle's wings? But that God and history have called upon us to do. Does history always call us upon us to do good things? I think history could teach us to do bad things too. So that those are all sort of meaningless political sentences that are part of political rhetoric. You hear them on television 24 hours a day, on CNN, on all the stations. This is the kind of statement you hear. And poetry, in a way, has to be the thing that fights that kind of inane, meaningless generalization. Bedrock, eagle's wings, and so forth. This is why Duchamp considered himself a nominalist. May I have the next slide, please? Next slide. Hello? Next slide. Yeah, thank you. There was one, I had a picture for you there too, but we need that. Okay, nominalism, he defined as this: no more generic, specific, numeric distinction between words. Remember this next one. Table is not the plural of table. Ate has nothing in common with eat. That's, of course, very exaggerated, but what he's saying is it makes a difference whether you say tables or table, ate or eat. No more physical adaptation of concrete words. No more conceptual value of abstract words. The word also loses its musical value. It is only readable due to being made up of consonants and vowels. It is readable by eye and little by little takes on a form of plastic significance. It is a sensorial reality, a plastic truth with the same title as a line or group of lines. So readable by eye, the poet Duchamp implies, is one who understands that ate has nothing in common with eat, that the same is never the same, and that every word counts. Poetry is, after all, the language art. To be a poet, in other words, is to draw on the verbal pool we all share, but to choose one's words and phrases with an eye to unexpected relationships, verbal, visual, sonic, that create a new construct and context, relationships that create infra-thin possibilities. And not only the poet, the reader, in turn, comes to poetry with an eye and an ear for such telling difference. Indeed, poetry might be defined as the art of the infrathin, the art in which difference is more important than similarity. The art in which difference is more important than similarity, because poets can take words, same words that everybody else takes, and make something special with them. Consider as well known a line as April is the cruelest month, the first line of The Wasteland. Now suppose it were April is the darkest month, or the harshest month, or the worst month of the year. April is the worst month of the year. It would mean just about the same, but the effect wouldn't be the same. And if not, why not? Doesn't cruelest stand out? Because unlike the other adjectives I just cited, it connotes human agency. Darkest month, harshest month, don't include that kind of human agency, the cruelest month. It also is notable for its sound, because the echo of April in cruel, April, and they look the same on the page, is obviously intentional. So consider the context too. Words as we use them don't appear alone. They're embedded in phrases, clauses, and in poetry, in lines like April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Now the line breaks are very peculiar: breeding, mixing, stirring. That's where the line breaks. All of them following present participles: breeding, mixing, stirring. And these participles have surprising objects. How is it, for example, that the dead land breeds lilacs? Then again, breeding in Duchampian terms, and I think of his famous glassware called dust breeding, is not the same as bread. The emphasis on the ongoing, an emphasis countered by the stoppage produced by the curious line breaks, is what gives the opening of The Wasteland its special frisson, its very special quality, that where every word counts. All right, so this next section is called The Question of Formalisms. Now, to understand how micropoetics can operate, I want to lay to rest two possible misconceptions regarding my Infrathin project. The first is that the close differential reading Duchamp advocates is just like close reading of the new criticism, and I'm sure you've all learned about that, and we always talk about it. Close reading, oh, it's only a close reading, or should we do close reading, and so on. The new criticism dominated the American literary scene, and especially the Academy, from the late 1930s to at least the mid-60s, but actually longer. I mean, well into the end of the century, that was the basic method we use in classrooms in teaching poetry. But there's actually, what I'm doing is not like the new criticism. A text like Cleanth Brooks's The Well-Wrought Urn of 1947, which served as a kind of Bible for the movement, was based on the principle that, as Brooks's opening chapter explains it, the language of poetry is the language of paradox. Next slide, please. In John Donne's The Canonization, Brooks's Exhibit A, the basic metaphor, next slide, and metaphor is at the very heart of poetry, which underlies the poem, involves a sort of paradox. And this is what Cleanth Brooks writes. For the poet, John Donne daringly treats profane life as if it were divine love. The canonization is not that a pair of holy anchorites who have renounced the world and the flesh. The hermitage of each is the other's body, but they do renounce the world, and so their title to sainthood is cunningly argued. The poem then is a parody of Christian sainthood, but it is an intensely serious parody. Now note that the underlying assumption here, which Brooks doesn't say in so many words, but it's clearly the assumption, is that poetry is designed to convey a special meaning. It's all about meaning. That meaning, as Brooks makes clear throughout, is not scientific meaning. It's not a question of facts or information, but a meaning only poetry can convey. Structure, in other words, is always semantic structure. Thus, even the wasteland, with all its complexities, so Brooks explains in his earlier modern poetry and the tradition, is if I may have the next slide. Yeah, the wasteland is built on a major contrast, a device that is a favorite of Eliot's. The contrast is between two kinds of life and two kinds of death. Life devoid of meaning is death. Sacrifice, even the sacrificial death, may be life-giving and awakening to life. The poem occupies itself to a great extent with this paradox and with a number of variations upon it. The basic method used in The Wasteland may be described as the application of the principle of complexity. The poet works in terms of surface parallelisms, which in reality make ironic contrasts, and in terms of surface contrasts, which in reality constitute parallelisms. The two aspects taken together give the effect of chaotic experience ordered into a new whole. Now, that's actually very well put, and this became a major reading. I mean, this became a very famous essay. It justified The Wasteland, and it's very interesting. And Brooks gives a masterly exposition of the way each second, say the game of chess, section 2, reiterates the central Christian paradox. But although the last chapter of this book, Modern Poetry and Their Tradition, same thing in the well-wrote urn, is called The Heresy of Paraphrase, and it says that the language of a particular poem cannot be altered without destroying its complexity, and that hence prose paraphrase is not possible. The fact remains that what matters to Brooks, and this was true of such fellow new critics as Robert Penn Warren, Alan Tate, and R.P. Blackmore, is an extricable and larger meaning. In other words, you can take the meaning out of the poem. You can get this meaning, which you have up here on the screen, that the wasteland, the topic of the wasteland, is a paradox, a contrast between two kinds of life and death. Life can be a form of death, and death can be life-giving. That basic paradox, which is the Christian paradox, and death can be life-giving in terms of resurrection, and death can be like life. So it's not a matter of that being right or wrong, but the fact is he's taking a meaning out of the poem, whereas Duchamp would say it only means what it has right there. You cannot extricate a meaning that you can state in such an abstract form as Brooks does here. And in any case, he's only really interested in meaning. Rhythm, sound, visual patterning, etymology, these are all but ignored. They just didn't pay any attention to that. The whole idea, and this is still the idea today, I can't stress this enough for you, is that when you read poetry criticism in Poetry Magazine, I'm sure in your magazines too, in any magazine or in most books, it's only about what it says. What does it mean? Why is that the main thing? I mean, there are all kinds of other ways to derive important meanings. And so this emphasis on meaning, completely divorced from the sound structure of what it sounds like and what it looks like. After all, in the 20th century, where typography becomes so important, what a poem looks like matters a lot. Now, you can lineate anything, but lineation alone is not usually enough, and we're going to look at examples in a minute. Now, there were certain exceptions among the new critics. W.K. Wimsatt, I don't know if you know that name, who taught at Yale for years. W.K. Wimsatt, in the verbal icon, has some brilliant chapters on rhyme and rhetorical features in the poetry of Alexander Pope and on the historical evolution of symbolic imagery from the late 18th century to Wordsworth. But even here, sound structure and rhetorical device are always secondary, a given antithesis or chiasmus being designed to convey the particular verbal ambiguity that belongs to poetry. Now, with that kind of emphasis on metaphor and symbol, such modernists as William Carlos Williams, whose lyric is given to literal language, metonymy, and visual design, were dismissed by the new critics as wholly negligible. When you read these books, these old books by Cleant Brooks, Wimsatt, so forth, they never mention Williams, who we think is a very important poet, because he was so literal and he worked so much with the visual design of poetry that they didn't think he was important at all. As for Ezra Pound, whose poetry could hardly be said to order chaotic experience into new holes, the cantos, to me, one of the really great, great American poem, and I have a chapter on it in this book. It was just dismissed by people like R.P. Blackmore as a rag bag of miscellaneous items. You can still read a lot of reviews that will say, what keeps the cantos together? Nothing. It has no structure. It's just, a rag bag in that kind of way. So the radical difference we associate with the Infrathin was thus precisely what the new criticism tried to suppress. Its close readings were pointedly not so close as to open up the text to particular contradictions or to explore the role context plays in the reception of a given text. Accordingly, only certain poets could count. Donne was more important than Milton, Keats rather than Shelley. Among American modernists, Robert Frost and later Robert Lowell, but never Robert Creeley, never Gertrude Stein. She was nobody knew what to do with her because it just looked literal. Nobody could figure out how to read these strange poems and so forth. A closer analog to the practice of micropoetics may be found in the groundbreaking work of the Russian formalists, who remain a century after they wrote their key text, perhaps the most important theorists of poetics in the modern period. This is not the place to give a lengthy account of the Russian formalists. I want merely to point to key elements that have directed my own thinking on this subject. For starters, it's important to remember that Roman Jakobson, who was probably the most famous of the Russian formalists, began his career as a poet, in alliance with the futurist Velimir Klebnikov and Alexei Khrushchevnik, both of whom made a strong case for the primacy of form over content in poetry. Genuine novelty in literature, wrote Khrushchevnik, does not depend on content. If there's a new form, there will also exist a new content. Form creates new content. From these poets' doctrines of the emancipation of the word, and especially on Klebnikov's close study of morphology and poetic neologism, Jakobson developed his now well-known doctrine of literaturnos, literariness, not literature as such, not the literariness. What gives something literariness, rather than the broader category, literature, as the object of the critic's study. If the central question was to be what makes a verbal message a work of art, it followed that questions of sound and visual form were just as important as questions of meaning. And so we get the axiom, this is Roman Jakobson's axiom, in poetry, any conspicuous similarity in sound is evaluated in respect to similarity and/or dissimilarity of meaning. In other words, as soon as you have similar sounds, if you go bow, wow, wow, it's going to suggest certain things, or even just words that aren't onomatopoeic words like that, but that have some kind of relationship, puts them together in your mind and gives them a special relationship. But one may well ask, isn't Jakobson's insistence on the separation of the aesthetic from all other textual functions the very antithesis of Duchamp's nagging question, can one make works that are not works of art? That has become a very famous question. Thierry Deduve wrote a whole book about, taking off from that, this question that Duchamp posed. Can one make works that are not works of art? And by that he meant works that have the usual aspects of art that we recognize right away as art. Can one make works that are not works of art? Yes and no. In the first interview that Duchamp gave Pierre Cabanne, Duchamp remarks, I shy away from the word creation. In the ordinary social meaning of the word, well, it's very nice, But fundamentally, I don't believe in the creative function of the artist. He's a man, should be a woman, he's a man like any other. It's his job to do certain things, but the businessman does certain things also. You understand? On the other hand, the word art interests me very much. If it comes from Sanskrit, and I've heard, it signifies making. In Sanskrit, signifies making. So what Duchamp is saying here, he's always very interested in art, but not so much in the artist, and to make such a fuss about the artist rather than to look at what has been done. The notion of making, poesis, presented no problem to Duchamp. It is the second term, art, he found unsatisfactory. For centuries, he understood art, that is visual art, had referred primarily to only one visual art, namely painting. Indeed, the two words have often been used interchangeably, as in such book titles as The Art of Henri Matisse, The Art of So-and-so. You've seen all these. When you see that, The Art of So-and-so, it almost invariably refers to painting. And even the radical new art of Cubism referred to a style of painting, give or take the occasional sculpture made by Picasso or Braque, as well as painting cognates like drawing, watercolor, etching. But suppose Duchamp posited, if I may have the next slide, please. One substituted for the common synecdoche, the painter's hand, the individual talent to deploy line and color, or in the case of poetry, the expressive power of words to convey unique poetic emotion. Suppose one instead switched to the appropriation and reconfiguration of items already in existence. In the case of Duchamp's own ready-mades, as he called these, beginning with the urinal you have in front of you, the most famous ready-made, has become like a logo at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's, on every poster. Fountain by R. Mutt. That was an ordinary plumbing store object that Duchamp happened to buy, and he entered it in the Salon of the Independence in 1917, of which he was one of the organizers. And it came in a box, and the rule of that salon was that you could submit anything if you paid $75, and you could have two things in the show. So it was meant to be a show for anybody who wanted to be in a show. Duchamp submitted the urinal, saying, after all, you said one can submit anything, and they all said, no, that's not art, then they wouldn't take it. And Duchamp then wrote a little piece about it anonymously in a magazine called The Blind Man, where he said, it doesn't matter, it's not, he didn't make it with his hand, but he chose it. And choosing something is a very important aspect of art. What we now call conceptual art is the choice. Making certain choices is crucial. In the case of Duchamp's fountain, he then had it photographed. Next slide, please. He had the fountain photographed by the famous photographer Alfred Stieglitz against a background, a beautiful background. This was a painting by Marsden Hartley. And so it looks very nice. And it was jokingly called the Madonna of the bathroom, the Madonna of the bathroom. But see, here it already looks quite pretty. You see, and of course, the signature R. Mutt is important. Mutt and Jeff, the comic strip, and Mutt being a dog, and has all kinds of other notion. And notice that fountain, by the way, titles are always important. Fountains are important from art from the Renaissance to the present, pretty much. Fountains is a symbol of sexual potency, the water gushing forth, the beautiful fountains of Bernini in Rome, the fountain here, fountain there. So he took this urinal, turned it upside down, and called it fountain. So there are all kinds of things involved here. Choice, framing often mean everything. And gradually, Duchamp sensed, such conceptual works would come to be recognized as works of art, comparable to their seemingly antithetical counterparts. The interesting thing is, of course, millions of people have now imitated this, and you'll go to art shows and see something with an empty sink, and you'll all say, well, that's nothing much. Of course it isn't, because it was a one-time thing, and you can't just then recreate it by just doing the same thing. Duchamp also coined the related term delay, D-E-L-A-Y, as in to delay. The Bride, his famous work in glass, was a delay in glass. It was the poetic aspects of the word that I liked. He tells his interviewer, Kaban. I wanted to give delay a poetic sense I couldn't even explain. It was to avoid saying a glass painting, a glass drawing. The word delay pleased me at that point like a phrase one discovers. It was really poetic in the most Mallarméan sense of the word, so to speak. And the idea of delay that you have to think for a minute, what is it? Now, Duchamp gives no explanation beyond these words, but I think what he had in mind is the delay not of the art object itself, but as the perception of the viewer reader who confronts it. The delay that occurs when that viewer tries to take in what she is seeing. As such, a delay would be a temporal infra-thin, as in the velvet trousers, or the gunshot that you hear and then you see it in the target. That's a delay, right? In Jacobsonian terms, the delay would occur when we try to understand how the perceived similarity of sound in a given poem relates to a comparable similarity in meaning. It's the interval we experience as we recognize that even the same is not the same. Now, Russian formalist studies, we should note, never came around to studying the new hybrid art forms of the 20th century. The Russian formalists worked in the 1920s, basically. So they never really studied the ready-made, the installation, found poetry, things of that sort. But they understood it, the theory. The word, wrote Yuri Tinyanov in 1924, does not exist outside a sentence. An isolated word is not found in a non-phrasal environment. Rather, it is found in a different environment from the word in a sentence. If we pronounce an isolated dictionary word, we do not obtain the basic word, a pure lexical word, but simply a word in new circumstances. And he gives an example. Next slide, please. Gives the example of the Russian word zemlya, earth, soil, land, or ground. Now, he first listed four things. I couldn't put it all on the slide here. Zemlya and Mars means heaven and earth. Zemlya has all kinds of different meanings. Bury an object in the zemlya, in the black humus of the earth. Or 3, it fell to the zemlya, to the floor, which is a slightly different meaning. Or 4, native zemlya, which is your native land. Now, however various the meanings of zemlya here were, the unity of the lexical category, what Wittgenstein was to call family resemblances, allows a native speaker to construe the meaning in each instance without much difficulty. But as Tinyanov understood, it's the poet who knows how to make the most of the subtle and sometimes contradictory meanings that zemlya can have and can relate that word to its cognates. In a brilliant essay, itself a kind of prose poem called Z and Its Environments, the Russian poet Velimir Khlebnikov considered, and you have that here, the curious number of Z words relating to the nature of reflection. Names for universal reflectors: zemlya, earth; zvezdi, stars; ziri, another word for stars; zen, another word for earth. The ancient exclamation zirin may possibly have meant to the stars. The earth and the stars all shine by reflected light. The word zen, which means both earth and eye, and the word ziri, which means both star and eye, demonstrate that both earth and stars are understood to be universal reflectors. So, words that sound similar and that you think really have nothing in common, earth, stars, eye, those are all different words. But in fact, from the poet's point of view, they, in fact, do have a lot of things in common, and he teased out those meanings. In wintertime, the earth reflects rays, and so that season of the year is called zima, winter. In summer, it swallows them up. But where do they go, these rays of summer? They too become reflected in complicated ways, and these types of summer reflections, rays reflected by the universal mirror, also begin with Z. So the poet sees those things. And now he goes on to list a whole list of metonymic Z nouns designating summer heat and vegetation, culminating in the insight, zem, earth. I think I have it on the next slide. Or do I have it? Is this one? Can I see the next? No, let's go back a minute. Go back a minute. Yeah. I didn't put that on. But anyway, he ends by saying, Zem earth is the eternal reflector upon which people live. If Zen meets I, then Zem is the majestic Zen of the nighttime sky. Compare Tem, shadow, and Tem, darkness. The other reflecting points of the black night sky, Aziri and Zvezdi, stars. So, being the poet that he was, Khlebnikov studied etymologies. I'm sure this would be very interesting for you actually to do. Studied etymologies and saw that words that were seemingly unrelated actually are related in strange ways. And this whole doctrine from the Russian formalists was also picked up by the Prague linguistic circle. Jan Mukorowski reminds us that a simple sentence like, it's getting dark, made as a statement by A to B at a specific time and place means very differently when the same sentence is conceived as a poetic equation. Suppose you see that sentence, it is getting dark, within quotation marks, you look at it rather differently. The focal point of our attention, Mukorowski notes, will immediately become its relations to the surrounding contexture, even if it is only an assumed one. The same would be true for the examples of infra-thin Duchamp gives in his notes, the changing texture of the walls of a given container. The Russian formalists were at their best in their earlier relatively informal texts. I call your attention to Jakobson's wonderful, beautiful essay on a generation that squandered its poets, written in 1931 in response to Mayakovsky's suicide, in one of the great critical texts, I think. And Viktor Shklovsky's famous discussion of making it strange, to make strange, ostranение, and factura, density, have become classics. Later formalist works like Jakobson's exhaustive analysis of the two versions of Yeats's The Sorrow of Love are perhaps less suggestive as the early work. Literary criticism can never be an exact science, and Jakobson was at his best when he didn't try to give an exhaustive account of every part of speech and syllable count in a given poem. Then, too, as Mesternik insisted, Jakobsonian theory emphasizes system often at the expense of individual enunciation, thus playing down the dominant role context plays. So that was my slight reservation about the Russian formalists like Jakobson, but they're really great critics. Now, the notion of literary art as a labyrinth of linkages was developed by later poet critics, for example, the Brazilian poet Haroldo de Campos. Elaborating on Jakobson's insistence that any phonological coincidence is felt to be semantic kinship, de Campos gives the following French example. Next slide, please. Top of the page, Haroldo de Campos, died recently, both he and his brother, the important Brazilian concrete poets. Whereas for the referential use of language, it makes no difference. Now, he's giving a French example here because it's best in French, but we can do it in English too. Whereas for the referential use of language, it makes no difference whether the word astre, star, can be found with the adjective désastre, disastrous, star and disastrous, or the noun disaster, disaster. For the poet, this kind of discovery is of prime relevance. And what de Campos, I'm sure, has in mind is Baudelaire's famous poem, Le Voyage, which is one of the great poems of the mid-19th century that, say, Walter Benjamin talks about, where the idea of going on a voyage and then the disappointment of you've seen everything and it's really just you might as well have stayed home, that it's not so thrilling. These adventures are not so thrilling. And there's a stanza toward the end that goes, Nous avons vu des astres. I put it in English there for you. We have seen the stars. Et des flots, nous avons vu des sables aussi. And the seas, we've seen sands too. And malgré bien des chocs et d'imprévus désastres, and despite the many shocks and unforeseen disasters, nous nous sommes souvent ennuyés comme ici. We have often been bored as we are here. Now here the rhyming of astre and disaster, line 1 and line 3, are presented as alternatives. You see how brilliant those rhymes are? You can either have the stars up in heaven, or you can have disasters down in the real world, right? But neither one nor the other can allay the terrible ennui of modern life, Baudelaire put it. But the noun désastre is actually formed by combining the negative prefix de or d, that's just the negative prefix, non, right, with astron, Greek for star. So you get désastre by combining the negative prefix with that. In other words, the negative role of stars, to be ill starred. If you look at the etymology of the word disaster, disastrous, what it really, the etymology is not to be according to the stars, and hence to be ill starred. So, in fact, astre and disaster, nouns unrelated in ordinary discourse, do go together. In poetry, as Duchamp puts it, this time citing the sinologist Ernest Fenollosa, who was Pound's mentor, relations are more important than the thing related. And if there's one thing I want you to get out of this lecture, it's that idea, I hope. Relations are more important than the thing related, not the what, but the how. You can write a poem about anything. It can be a very trivial thing like the back of the hospital where nothing will grow, as in the Williams poem, or some of the little animals in Marion Moore's poems. Relations are more important than thing related because that's what a poet does. He relates items. And a lot of poetry you get to see today, there's nothing related at all. It's just lineated prose. It doesn't really do anything. Now, relatedness, Duchamp may well be thinking of his own long poem, Galaxias or Pound's Cantos, where the juxtaposition of individual motifs is perhaps at the furthest possible removal from any kind of prose paraphrase or discussion as to what the poem is about. But the process is, of course, also at work in more traditional lyric poems like Baudelaire's Voyage, which I just cited. One reason Baudelaire is so difficult to translate is that the rhymes like astre, désastre, aussi, ici, and rhetorical figures contain so much indirect and paragrammatic meaning. So let's just read that stanza again for a minute. I'm sorry, different one. Next page, please. Sorry, the next page. Next slide. Yeah, here's the opening stanza of that same poem. And again, you've got it in English there. I'll read it for you in French. Pour l'enfant, amoureux de cartes et d'estampes, l'univers est égal à son vaste appétit. Ah, que le monde est grand, à la clarté des lampes, au lieu de souvenir que le monde est petit. For the child who loves maps and stamps, I just gave you a literal reading, the universe is equal to his vast appetite. Ah, how large the world is by the light of the lamp. In the eyes of memory, how the world is small. And so you have not only rhyme, but you have chiasmus, the light of the lamp, and then in the eyes of memory, the reversal of phrasing. Now I'm going to, here are three translations, none of them satisfactory, I think, and you can't really have a satisfactory translation, I think, of Baudelaire. There are plenty of poets who translate perfectly well if it's in free verse. But in Baudelaire, the rhymes are so important, and to show you in a minute, and other figures are so important that it's hard to do. So here's the first one by Roy Campbell. For children crazed with maps and prints and stamps, the universe can sate their appetite. How vast the world is by the light of lamps, but in the eyes of memory, how slight. Let's read the other two. Richard Howard. The child enthralled by lithographs and maps can satisfy the hunger for the world. How limitless it is beneath the lamp, and how it shrinks in the eyes of memory. And finally, Keith Waldrop, a prose translation. For the child who likes maps and stamps, the universe is a match for his vast appetite. Ah, how large the world is in lamplight. In memory's eye, how the world is small. Now, Campbell's is the only one of the three to adopt Baudelaire's rhyme scheme, A, B, A, B. But his rhymes don't have Baudelaire's semantic charge, of which more in a moment. And a shift from singular to plural in line one, children, we could talk about that for quite a while. Children is obviously not here's a good example of tables is not the same as table. Children is not the same as child. Baudelaire is talking about the child, and of course he's really talking about himself. He was that child, pour l'enfant, for the child. So when you say children, you generalize that way. It's already seems to be a pretty bad mistake, and he did that to get the rhyme. Then he adds the gratuitous noun prints, maps and prints and stamps. There are no prints in the original. It's just, maps and stamps. So I don't know where prints came in. And then what he does with the chiasmus, is how vast the world is by the light of lamps, but in the eyes of memory, how slight really loses the force of that couplet. And in Richard Howard's rather lackluster translation, which avoids rhyme and substitutes lithographs. Why do we have lithographs there? For stamps in line 1, a change that makes no sense since this child is obviously a stamp collector. And the fourth line, and how it shrinks in the eyes of memory, dissolves Baudelaire's tight sound structure into a prosaic comment. Keith Waldrop's is the most literal of the three, and he does keep the chiasmus of the original, but as a prose strophe or verset, as he calls his units, the translation can't capture the drama of the original. Indeed, no translation can reproduce the effect of Baudelaire's rhymes. Now take a look at appétit and petit in the original. Appetite and small, appetit and petit. The word appétit comes from the Latin past participle appetitus of the verb appetere, ad petere, to desire, to long for. Appetite is a matter of desire, longing, a hunger for something. It's a strong emotion. Now, by rhyming appétit with petit, small, the poem anticipates what will gradually be shown in the course of the poem, that in the course of one's life, human appetite will be rewarded by only the smallest satisfactions. So all that meaning is already and all in those seemingly minor words. And you get the same thing in stanza 2, where I don't you have it on the page here, where les désirs amers, bitter desires, rhymes with des mers, oceans. The implication being that the longed for exotic waters of the distant oceans turned out to be the site of mere bitterness. Now, it is such verbal play, often discernible only on a second or third reading, that gives Baudelaire's poems their special, wonderful aura as well as their great memorability. And we might note that he's also a master of indeterminacy, à la clarté des lampes, at the light of the lamps. It refers to the lamplight beneath which the child is looking at his stamps and maps. But clarté also means clarity. In childhood, things seem clear. The grown-up must learn otherwise. The English lamplight that Keith Waldrop puts in cannot convey the subtlety of meaning. For the Anglophone reader, or I take the Indian reader, there's no good solution, but the recognition that in translation, infra-thin shades of meaning may well be lost can stimulate the translator to produce parallel constructions that may well be satisfying. I'm not saying you couldn't translate this poem. The best way might be to make it quite different, to use the basic ideas, but to write it differently. Nathan Brown in Canada has just done a new translation of Infrathin, which I like quite a bit, where he keeps the grammar pretty much intact and he keeps some of the rhymes, but he actually changes some of the meaning, but that's all right. I mean, it becomes a kind of new poem. But these three translators are trying to get it right, translate it properly, and it doesn't really work. And that teaches you how important the most minor, things are. Okay, now I'm coming to my last section, which is called A Mania for Change. In time, the same object is not the same after a 1-second interval. Remember, that was one of the infrathins. The infrathin Duchamp assisted is always temporal as well as spatial, and the artist himself was extremely sensitive to historical change as it affected his own work. In the interviews with Caban, he recalls in great detail how eager he was in the early 1910s to separate himself from the Cubists who were becoming the rage of the avant-garde. I tried constantly, Duchamp tells the interviewer, to find something which would not recall what had happened before. I've had an obsession about not using the same thing. It was a constant battle to make an exact and complete break. Now, why this mania for change? Duchamp's detractors have suggested that he realized his early paintings couldn't compete with those of Picasso or Braque, and that he hence had to find something else to get recognition. But a more charitable interpretation would be that Duchamp somehow understood that even the painting of Picasso, however formally inventive, was still painting in the great retinal, as he called it, the retinal of the eye, tradition initiated by Courbet in the mid-19th century. Even his own Nude Descending a Staircase, Duchamp came to feel was too cubist. And he said, next slide, Since Courbet, it's been believed that painting is addressed to the retinal. That was everyone's era, the retinal shutter. Before, painting had other functions. It could be religious, philosophical, moral, and unfortunately hasn't changed much. A whole century is completely retinal, except for the surrealists who tried to go outside it somewhat, and still they didn't go very far. And that is a very important, notion, because if you think of the French Impressionists who immediately preceded Duchamp, the French Impressionists, and then the post-impressionists like Cézanne, and then came the Cubists, and always painting was the thing. And when he says the retinal shutter, he means that when you always look at it without anything conceptual, just something to look at, it devalues painting someone. And there used to be the famous simile, bête comme un peintre, stupid like a painter. That was a phrase used all the time in the 19th century and the early 20th. What's he like? Bête comme un peintre, stupid like a painter, because painting had that status. So Duchamp wanted to show there are, after all, other ways of making art. It doesn't have to be a painting. And the turning point for Duchamp was his year in Munich, where he went in 1912 and came into contact with an entirely different group of artists working under the influence of Kandinsky and the latter's on the spiritual and art. And he also spent hours in the Alte Pinakothek, the classical museum, studying the Cranachs, the wonderful Flemish paintings, and became interested in Renaissance perspective, which Apollinaire and the Cubists had so rejected. They argued that 20th century art had to be flat. Flatness was everything. No, Duchamp said, the perspective just has to be used differently. Aloofness became Duchamp's signature stance. In the early 1920s, when the Dadaists tried to claim him as a kindred spirit, he carefully kept his distance. You'll always read in handbooks that Duchamp was Dada, not quite accurate. Thus, when Tristan Tzara asked him to send something for the 1921 Dada Salon in Paris, Duchamp responded that he had nothing on hand and that anyway the verb to exhibit, exposer, sounded too much like the verb to marry, épouser. From afar, he wrote to Eddie Stettheimer, these movements seem charming, but they don't seem that way in close proximity. So exposer, épouser, an early instance of punning, wordplay, and infra-thin that Duchamp uses. To understand them, then, we'll have to see these works in their historical context. A meaningful, close reading cannot exist in the abstract, as it often did in the works of the new critics and Russian formalists. So in each of the essays in my book, I try to give, on the one hand, a very micro level reading, but also to historicize the word in their setting. So I won't now go through, I was going to go tell you what the different chapters were about. If we have time later, I'll do that. But I just want to conclude with this section and then have a look at Eliot for a minute. Language, not lyric. The last section here is called Language, not lyric. It should be clear to you by now that when I talk of poetry and the poetic, I'm generally using the term to refer to poetic language, not the genre lyric poetry. To talk of Renaissance lyric or romantic lyric makes good sense, but for at least the past century, some of the most significant poems like The Wasteland or Pound's cantos cannot really be classified under the rubric of the lyric. At the same time, the narrative poem has sort of disappeared. You don't see too many long narrative poems, replaced by the dominant literary form of prose fiction, the novel. And dramatic poetry has become quite simply drama. Where is dramatic poetry? So the word lyric no longer seems, I think, very helpful. But a lot of people disagree with me on this, and we can discuss it later. The word lyric is derived from the Greek musical instrument, the lyre. Originally, the lyric was a poem accompanied by the lyre, and this etymology gives us our own designation for song lyrics. But the musical definition never really took hold. Plato and Aristotle differentiated lyric from narrative and drama, the three constituting the dominant poetic modes. According to voice, the poet may speak either in his own person, Plato and Aristotle called that lyric. He may assume the voices of others, that's drama, or he may speak sometimes in his own voice, sometimes in the voice of others, and that would give you the novel where you get dialogue, but you get a narrator all the way through too, right? But as early as the Renaissance, with its proliferation of lyric genres, from songs and sonnets to odes and elegies and epigrams, the link of lyric to some form of subjectivity has become firmly established. From Wordsworth's poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, emotion recollected in tranquility, to Eliot's counterstatement, poetry is not the expression of emotion, but an escape from emotion. Personal feeling has been considered central to the first person mode. Recent models like Jonathan Culler and his influential theory of the lyric, 2015, tends to take their point of departure from the Romantics, especially from Hegel's lectures on the aesthetic, although Culler, like so many other theorists before him, qualifies and amends Hegelian doctrine at many points. Now here is Culler. Next slide. Next slide, please. Although the essence of lyric for Hegel is subjectivity attaining consciousness of itself through self-expression, he stresses that the lyric process is one of purification and universalization. The lyric is not a cri de coeur, cry of the heart. It becomes, this is from Hegel, the language of the poetic inner life, and therefore, however intimately the insights and feelings which the poet describes as his own belong to him as a single individual, they must nevertheless possess a universal validity. While declaring that the poet must recognize himself as himself in the particularization that his lyric offers, Hegel notes that despite the details a poet presents, we have no inclination at all to get to know his particular fancies, his amours, his domestic affairs. We want to have in front of us something universally human so that we can feel in poetic sympathy with it. Now, that's, Hegel is considered very important, but that really isn't, I think, a very good account of poetry in our relativist and populist century. The notion of universal validity. What is it? Today, of course, we're so caught up with identity politics, but what really can have universal validity of that sort? It seems increasingly elusive. The poets themselves hardly claiming to speak for everyone or about universal emotions. On the contrary, the discourse has moved in the opposite direction, taking into account the role of ethnicity, national identity, race, class, sex, and gender as determinants of a given poet's vision. Now, given the proliferation of these categories, the emphasis falls precisely on the particular, the unique, the detail that defies simple reproduction or reception, particular fancies, amours, domestic affairs. These are very much with us, whether in memoirs, personal, or poems. And I would like to bring up one other thing about why I don't think talking of lyric is very useful today, where all poetry is lyric, so there should be a different differentium. I don't think genre theories work very well. I could just come back to the question for a moment, isn't the same, at least the same. The attention to difference, to the infra-thin, is especially important, I think, in the age of digital reproduction. If you all know that if you substitute a single letter or punctuation mark in a given password, your document won't open, no matter how hard you try. You've got to get it right. Every letter stroke, every space matters. And when you dictate, say, an email, as I regularly do, sometimes lounging in bed early in the morning, the error can prove as embarrassing as when once I typed in the name Ashbury and it came out asshole. Or when Faulkner appeared, I'm not making this up, fuck you, Faulkner. Just by saying it, this is how Siri misconstrues it. With all the talk of artificial intelligence, Siri's imagination, it would seem, leaves much to be desired. She cannot, in any case, understand that Duchamp's 3 standard stoppages, one of his great works, created unequal line lengths, or that the pochoir replica of Nude Descending a Staircase is very different from the original, or that in Stein's short story, Miss Fur and Miss Skeen, the word gay keeps shifting meaning. So this is then my, wish to look at these details. And what I do in the book is that. So in the time remaining, and we don't have very much time, I wanted to look at a poem I thought you all probably knew and which comes up in a later chapter. So let's go on to the next slide. Yeah. And that is the beginning of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And Eliot was a genius really at that's why I think this poem has really lived on in amazing ways. Now he reads it himself in a very, formal way. Let us go then, you and I. But anyway, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Now notice that I think I put this on the next slide. Can we have the next one for a minute? Yeah. Now look at the bar in the middle is a caesura, a break, and I just put in the stress marks. So we get, and the circumflex, the little caret, means secondary stress, not quite as strong as the first. Now look at that line. Let us go then, you and I. Every single, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 syllables, and every syllable is heavily stressed, and there's the break in the middle, so you have to say it slowly. Let us go then, you and I. It seems almost as if the poet is asleep, or the narrator rather is asleep. So tired. Let us go then, you and I. And then the next line is very different. When the evening is spread out against the sky, at least 6 primary stresses, sky rhyming with I, and more open, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Every line has a different stress and syllable count, but that doesn't mean it's free verse. Free verse, Eliot did not really care for free verse. He said the ghost of a meter is always lurking behind the curtain, even when something looks free. Now, the second line, when the evening is spread out against the sky, it drags along again a kind of catatonic torpor, and you get internal rhyme of then, when, against, and that extends into line 3, which is even longer, 12 syllables and markedly ungainly. It's not a pretty line, like a patient etherized upon a table. It's such a famous metaphor, you have to practically spit it out, like a patient etherized upon a table. Look at the way the unvoiced consonants work there. In his introduction to the selected poems of Ezra Pound, Eliot made an important comment on verse form that illuminates his own technique. And he said, people often wonder why poets do not remain content with the vocabulary in the verse forms inherited from older poets who have done well with them, and why poets insist on devising new forms, which seem at first uglier and more disorderly. Something is constantly happening in any living languages. The changes in the world about us and the lives we live are reflected in our speech, so that a verse form which once was natural, which once was a development of the way people talked in ordinary intercourse, can become artificial. I think that's what's happened to blank verse, that the way we talk nowadays does not fit naturally into that frame. Now, what he meant there was that whereas Wordsworth's Prelude, the whole thing is in blank verse, Milton's Paradise Lost is in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter is blank verse, 10 syllables, 5 stresses, main stresses to the line, that every verse form, of course, has to go with its own time. So you can argue, well, I'll come back to free verse in a minute. In Prufrock, in any case, blank verse, indeed, any iambic pentameter becomes no more than a shadow, a backdrop against which the new free verse asserts itself. It is free in the sense that no 2 lines here are alike. But of course, Eliot's verse is never really free. At every second, its structure is charged with meaning. So let's go. Can we go back one, please? Back to the previous slide. Yeah. So in line 5, the muttering retreats, which only has 6 syllables, literally provides an echo, as in a dark passageway of the preceding 11-syllable line. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats. Isn't that one wonderful effect? Through certain half-deserted streets, shorter line. It rhymes. The muttering retreats, you can hear it. It's like going down the pavement almost. It is so wonderfully done. as a response. And now the poem shifts ground and moves into a parodic rhyming iambic pentameter couplet. You haven't had any iambic pentameter yet, but now you get it. And it goes like this: of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. Of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, 10 syllables, 5 stresses, of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. So there's what looks like a normal iambic pentameter couplet, just to round things out. But the couplet is incredibly striking, and every time I look at it, I find more in it. You have a sing-song metrical bass of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, but you get the repetition of those stinging ST and TS phonemes: restless nights, hotels, sawdust, restaurants. The sound keeps repeating itself, that sound. And night, with the noun changing its meaning as it morphs into adjective, and rest, and the rhyming of hotels with shells. Restless restaurants is not only sonic, the word restaurant, it all picks up all the phonemes of retreats in the previous line, comes from the French verb restaurer, to restore to a former state. And restaurants, by etymology, was originally a place where you'd go for food as a form of restorative. You're traveling and you stop at a restaurant in French, because that's a place where you can stop and restore yourself. So the idea of restoring yourself, of being restless in these restaurants, is especially ironic. So no other word would do. Now, when you read poetry this way, ask yourself what it would be like if we replaced the word. So suppose you had, if we replaced restless with uneasy, and so we would have restless nights in one-night cheap hotels, and uneasy nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. You're already ruining the whole thing because you don't have that relationship. All right, and what about if we change those hotels of restless nights in one-night flop houses, or in one-night dumps, or in something like that, of restless nights in nights and night, cheap hotels. The sound keeps getting picked up. So it's very important to have that. It won't do to have any other word, I think. And not only oral effect, but semantic density. Eliot's avant-garde invention, an invention that went much further than the precepts of imagism, of futurism, was that the new poetry of the 20th century, now composed on the typewriter, would be both seen and heard, and must pay attention to each letter, syllable, and word in a given poem. In Prufrock's impotent word, the aphrodisiac oyster. Oysters, are known as being aphrodisiac. But here we don't have oysters. We only have oyster shells. And where are they? On the sawdust floor. And sawdust sets the stage for the soot that falls into chimneys, which will come up in the next section. But sawdust floors, I think, are so perfect. I mean, literally, there are sawdust floors in restaurants like that, with all that sawdust all over the floor. But the saw and dust, you can do things with this yourself. And the idea of being covered with oyster shells. So that is the mood here. Everything is dead, dirty, unhappy. We don't know why yet. We don't know what's wrong with Prufrock. Excuse me. But that's how he sees things. He sees things this way. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky. So the evening clouds, let's say, or fog, like a patient etherized upon a table. That's how it looks and feels. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells. So Prufrock is famous for its metaphor. It's certainly metaphors, conceits, like patient etherized upon a table, but the avant-garde invention, as I say, really is not even so much metaphor as the the sound structure and the look on the page, and you can go through the whole poem and see that. Those things must make a difference. Otherwise, why would things be lineated? So I will end with that thought that what I'm trying to do and show at a time where poetry is always talked about just about its content. What is it about? What does it say? What is its political import? That why lineate at all, or why have this kind of thing? You enjoy poetry so much more if you look at the infra-thin references, the tiniest meanings, and that you have in a great poem like this, or in so many other, any number of examples. So I'll stop there. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think the timing is good. Yeah.
So, thank you, Marjorie. It's been, I think it's been excellent. I just stayed completely enthralled by what you said, and it was so poetic. It was so introspective, and it had everything, because I'm somebody who loves to do poetic criticism, and I wonderfully connected with your talk. Thank you for this excellent presentation, and I really genuinely mean that. We have certain questions coming through, and so we are just going to ask the question. But before I do that, there are a few things that I also wanted to ask before we move on to the other questions. I was in a way interested in Duchamp's, and especially Duchamp's, when Duchamp is talking about the random in painting. And I have been writing about Duchamp and random in painting for quite some time now. And I thought whether this random really is somewhere connected to the delay that you were talking about, because when there is something random, then there is a difference, or rather an infra-thin difference, between what you understand as predictable, expected, and the normal, and what really comes to you as a kind of an accident, if at all we can say that something unexpected, an unexpected incident is an accident.
That's a wonderful question.
Yes.
That's a really good question, because it's certainly unexpected. Things are very unexpected, but I would argue they're not random. Duchamp always pretended, just anything you find in the hardware store. I did a very interesting exercise many years ago with a friend of mine when I was teaching at USC, who was in art history, and she told the students to bring in a ready-made. And the next day, everybody came in and they would hold up a sock. And they'd say, here's my ready-made. And everybody would say, that's not a ready-made, that's nothing. Or they would hold up, I don't know, here's a bookmark or whatever. And the students would say, that's nothing. And actually, if you study Duchamp's ready-mades, and they've been so imitated, they're all industrial objects. They're all eroticized objects. Every single one, the snow shovel, whatever they are, the bottle dryer, which is called l'égouttoir, to take the taste out of the bottle. And you have the empty bottles on these little sticks, and they're all sexy, the bicycle wheel. And so they're all of the industrial age. There's not a single one that isn't. Coat hangers, things that you have in the house. They're all similar in a way. They have family resemblances. And so I don't think Duchamp is an artist of the random. Somebody much more seemingly random is John Cage, and he's not really so random either. So I would say it is a calculated randomness. It's meant to look random, and the artist pretends. Duchamp would say, I just happened to walk into this, and I saw a snow shovel. But now, why did he buy a snow shovel? I have a whole essay on that. The snow shovel hangs at the Museum of Modern Art, just an ordinary snow shovel. It hangs in one room from the ceiling. Well, first of all, in France, they didn't have snow shovels. People didn't shovel snow. That wasn't even done. But the shovel relates to all kinds of American imagery of labor. There are things that might have been Duchamp's model that have the same kind of shovel, but it's not hanging from the ceiling. Somebody is using it. And so once you get to know the different ones, they all have all kinds of references like Fountain. And I don't think they are random because I say it's a matter of choosing. Now, people often feel, here's the thing about conceptual art and poetry. There was a lot of excitement about conceptual poetry a few years ago. Kenneth Goldsmith, all these people. And I'm very interested in it, but a lot of it also isn't very good. It's very hard to do well. In other words, people thought all you have to do is read some political article, or you read about Guantanamo Bay, and then you remove, you take the text out of its source, and you cut it up in some kind of way, and you present it very interesting. I mean, we all know what we think about Guantanamo Bay. There's really no tension, nothing. So it's not so easy to do these things, just the way it wasn't easy for Duchamp to choose the objects, and he chose very few. He actually did, he never did too much, but they're all related. And you remember when I said relatedness is more important than what you relate? The great thing always in any, I know you've written a lot about Robert Frost. The relatedness is amazing. If you look at those poems, go back and do it now and see how in Desert Places, a poem like that, stays with how the rhymes and then relate to other things in the same line, and you get secondary meanings. And it's just an amazing thing. Really amazing. Yeah.
Is there, if it's a question from, before I start asking a question, is there a question from my faculty? Is there a question from my faculty? And I would just like...
So we can't see anybody. There's no way we can see each other.
Ranjan, I have just posted a question in the chat box.
Ashita, can you answer that
It's a little longish. I'm extremely sorry for that. It's fabulous presentation, Professor. Thank you very much for that.
So can you ask the question, please?
Yeah, I can read out, no problem.
Yeah, please. Please.
I just posted it in the chat box. I'm not for unimaginative thematization of the sociological in literature, let alone in poetry. Poetry is successful when it is poetically functional. Can the broader question for a literary artist or critic be whether form itself is a matter of social formation? For example, the emergence of concrete or later digital poetry following certain technological innovations. Again, occasions for mediations in art may be more than simply technological. For example, the holes shot or made into Duchamp's large glass can be read in contexts of the ongoing World War I, the pace of industrialization, and so on. Now, can the about, within inverted commas, as life reality, not the narrowly didactic, often the two are mixed, not have an encounter, my emphasis is on the word encounter, with art reality in such non-causal, unpredictable ways, either in the process of writing, curating, or reading, spectating. My question, an old one, is not limited to poetry alone. Thanks so much for your patience.
I think that's a great question. I agree completely. Of course it can. Look, even I've worked on concrete poetry a lot, and there's the little poem by Augusto de Campos that's called Viva Vaya. That's all. V-I-A-I. I wish I could show it to you. In red on white, Vaya. And that really means it's a cheer. It's a cheer. Football games, soccer games. Hooray, hooray, and woo. But actually that poem was written at a particular occasion when there was the dictatorship. Of course, we have another dictatorship in Brazil now, the terrible dictatorship. And then that dictatorship was threatened. And at a particular moment, those words were used, and he played upon that. And it doesn't look like a political poem, but in fact, it is. My favorite political poem, in a certain way, of course, it is very important, but it's a matter of tension. As you said, a kind of sociological impact is Yeats's Easter 1916, which you probably know. Now, what's interesting about that poem is it's written to celebrate the rebels of the Easter uprising, a very specific thing again. And the historical and political frame was the Easter Revolution, when they marched on the post office in 1916 because the English had promised home rule. And then they didn't come through with it. They might have come through with it later, but they hadn't. And so the Irish had enough, so they decided they were going to get home rule themselves. And Yeats wrote this poem. He was in despair in a way because Marjorie, the woman he loved, was involved. But he celebrated the noise. He celebrated MacDonagh and MacPherson and Donnelly and wherever green is worn, all changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. It's a terrible beauty. Now, on the one hand, he celebrates the patriot, but then there are certain lines of the poem where he asks, was it needless death after all? What a line. Was it needless death after all for English make he fed? For a minute he thinks, well, we're not sure. It might have been different. So I feel that the important thing is, and this relates to using the language the way I'm talking about, or let's say the people in the large class, is there has to be complexity. There has to be some kind of tension. And where it isn't, to me, that I once wrote a piece about Denise Levertov's political poems on the Vietnam War. And I said, what I didn't like about them is she always had the answers and no one else did. This is a very bad stance for a poet, that I know the answer. I know how bad this is, but no one else does. So let me tell them. So she had a poem that went, revolution and death, revolution and death. Death is Mayor Daley, the mayor of Chicago. Do you realize how quickly that poem dates? Death is Mayor Daley. Do we care now? You see what I mean? So that doesn't work too well. I should have also said that, when I mentioned the new criticism, if I'd had more room, and Russian formalism, the other mode, I was thinking it because we were so sad about the death of Hillis Miller, which happened so recently. I really wanted to dedicate this to him. Hillis Miller, in his phenomenological phase, wrote a book called Poets of Reality, where it's another form of very close analysis that I think is brilliant, where he took things, whether they were in letters or they were in poems or they were, whatever the poet had written, and tried to get the consciousness of the poet also in relationship to the period and what was going on at the period and so on. It's very hard to do all these things, but you have to try. And of course, in the contemporary period, we feel, well, we sort of know what goes on, but we don't really, because it's all made very easy. If we just have protest poems or whatever it is, it's going to date very quickly. So anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Okay. I'll remember your lecture for a long, long time to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Wish I could see you. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, my webcam is not working, unfortunately. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, Ashish. Okay.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. I'm Ashish. Okay. Nice meeting you and listening to you.
Marjorie, we have the next question here from Shumana Roy. And Shumana, yes. She's
a great poet, yeah.
She has a question for you, and she considers this lecture to be a brilliant lecture, and she says that you have given me a lot to think about. And I say this.
I admire her poetry very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I say this as someone who was raised by close reading without being aware that it was a new criticism. I share this piece of information so that you know that I am not against new criticism. I would like to know your thoughts about whether the new critics encourage the culture of the excerpt, as say we in the essay, the naked newborn babe, and whether the culture of about that is on par today is a reaction to that. That is also related to my curiosity about what you think about the career of close reading in the last 100 years. Do you think that the life and death of close reading was in some way dependent on the Cold War, and whether its marginalization for the culture of about is related to the end of the Cold War?
Well, okay, that's a really, wow, very interesting. I think this, first of all, the new critics in a way were wonderful. It meant that in classrooms, everybody sat and actually really looked at the poem, didn't just talk about, as in earlier periods. You have to think of earlier periods where they talked about how many rivers did Spencer talk about and what were their names, things of this sort, where you really didn't deal with the poetry at all. So the new criticism in ways was very helpful, but it was very conservative. It was written by a group of very Christian all writers, all of them, who were always finding these Christian paradoxes like life and death and so forth, and the extract, the little extract. And as I say, they totally ignored, they had a very narrow canon of modernism, and they totally ignored the other poets and paid no attention to them at all that didn't fulfill that particular kind of poetry. So then there was a lot of close reading on the campus, and there was already a reaction against it when I wrote about Frank O'Hara in that period, in the 60s. Frank O'Hara made fun of Robert Lowell, Skunk Hour, and didn't like that whole idea and wanted poetry to be much more spontaneous, in the age of the beats and so on. But that went on till about, well, I don't want to give a whole history of American poetry here, but when you say the end of the Cold War, I'm not sure, first of all, the Cold War has really ended. Let's first of all say that. I'm just about to review Louis Menand's book, which is on the writing of the Cold War from 1945 to the Vietnam War. But what's happened in poetry in the last 20 years or so in the United States, not at all everywhere. It's not true in every country, but I think, unfortunately, it is true in the United States. It's just all standards have just disappeared. I don't know, people sort of forgot about it. It's partly the creative writing programs, which have good things, but bad things. And people can get away with murder. I really think so. I think most of it isn't poetry. By my lights, most of what's written isn't poetry. I don't know why it's called poetry. And I do feel I could write it. I could write as well as most of these people who just, so much, you want to cut out all the filler. As I was going down whatever street, get rid of all, you don't need all those words, and that's one part of it. Then, of course, it is wonderful that we have the various minority poetries, but it has created a situation where, at least for the moment, it's just all about, that you have to be, I don't know, a lesbian Black woman at Kelly Writer's house at Penn. I think you visited that, didn't you? I'm not sure. Did you visit that Al Filreis and the Kelly's Writer's House, which I love? But right now is a very bad time in the United States, just a terrible time for the arts. I can't begin to say how bad I think it is, and the cancel culture. And it has caused firings and all that. The editor of poetry, Don Scher, had to resign from being the editor of poetry, all those stories. So they're really not quite a joke. It's like in the Soviet Union, really, in that way. So would we were still in the Cold War when you had a lot of good poetry, I hate to say. I mean, it was in the Cold War that you had Donald Allen's anthology, The New American Poetry. You had incredible things going on and incredible interest in poetry. Now, most American universities don't even teach modern poetry. It's not taught. Or contemporary poetry. It's only creative writing programs where you have poetry. It's not taught as a scholarly course or as a critical course, really. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'd like to hear what you think, really, much more than what I think. What do you think? Tamana.
Well, I think, Marjorie, yes, we can move over to we have lots of questions coming, but there is the general question that I can see among the many that I've been receiving is that people are very interested to know what is your fundamental premise of micropoetics. That's what people are very interested to see. And also there is a question by Abhijit Ghosh, who points out that poetics of micropoetry, concrete poetry, even microfiction is so deeply embedded in rhythm, sound structure, visual patterning, etymology that one cannot but engage with infra-thin reading. So his question is that, don't you think that the infra-thin reading or writing practice is prerequisite to the domain of micro minimalist
Yes,
literature.
actually, that's what I meant. I don't mean micropoetics and microfiction or or small little poems. I'm sorry, that's bad if you think that. I only mean it in terms of a reading. I wrote an essay actually together with Sushi Kao, a wonderful woman who writes very witty and brilliant criticism. And we did a thing on methods for critical reading, which is in poetry. You can read it in PN Review, that British journal, both of our essays. Her name is Q Lee. Q Lee. She's Korean. Anyway, but has lived in England and now and in the United States. And we talked about just that what I'm talking about by micropoetics is not that I'm looking at micro works. On the contrary, I talk about the cantos in chapter 3, and I talk about a lot of long works too, but a reading method. I just mean that as a reading methodology, and of course it's extreme in a way. I also love discussions of social issues and political issues and so forth. So the point of view in this book is to calculatedly a little bit extreme as a corrective for never looking at all, for never looking at those things as if sound didn't exist. As if it made no difference at all. Well, obviously, it does in poetry. How can it not make a difference? Or the visual, how something looks. And now, for instance, I wrote a lot earlier about the so-called language poets, Charles Bernstein, whom Ranjan knows well, and various others. And one of the weak points of language poetry was great as far as other kinds of complexity I could talk about in terms of micropoetics, but they really didn't think in terms of the look at all. They're all just print blocks on the page. They just look like blocks of print. It doesn't make any difference. You could change the lines around. You could relineate them and people would never notice the difference. So it's odd that happened. And then there are other groups where the visual is more striking, but we do live in a predominantly visual culture now, so that I do think that the visual is taking on more importance all the time. It's bound to. It's got to, because people, even if you go to poetry readings, people usually see it first on this page or on the screen, perhaps primarily on the screen. And then there's the whole idea, of course, you could move things around on the screen and redo somebody's poems, or at least do them differently. Will it make any difference? And so on. So it all becomes a very interesting issue. But I think there's a lot of interesting poetry now coming out, as I say, from the not the old capitals like London and Paris. I think coming out of, I've seen lots of interesting work from India, I'm not just saying that, and from Saudi Arabia. There's a new book that somebody wrote on Arab poetry that I found very interesting, the kinds of forms and so on. I think Scandinavian poetry is very interesting. Korean poetry is interesting. It's just right now, the United States is kind of in a stage where, it's all anger. Everybody's angry at everybody else, kind of. I mean, you just read ridiculous. I'll give you an example. The last few days, there's been all the fuss about what happened in Atlanta, right? To the Asian American poetry. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, but I find that term Asian American a kind of insult. I mean, you can't really compare China, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Japan, India. I think there's so many different cultures and great cultures that, to me, this term Asian American, as if all Asian Americans are alike, is kind of ridiculous too. Asian Americans have been among the most successful people in America, but the places where these incidents have taken place are poor places, and it's more a class thing. And in this guide, the guy was a nut, whatever. It's a class thing. Class is a great neglected thing today. It's a class thing, not so much a race thing. So when I have to hear every minute about, oh, how terrible, and we must do something about hate crime, Asian American, hate crime against Asian Americans, what does that mean? I don't even know what that means, what that really means. And you have to specify. And that's where the infra-thin can come in. It's really more philosophy than just in terms of poetry, because I feel that until we specify things more fully, we can't really talk about things. And as I say, India, as you know better than I, is not the same as China or Japan or Korea or Vietnam or, Singapore, even, for that matter, right? I don't know how you feel about that, but
Marjorie, on that note that you mentioned that as we move from one country to one culture to another, we start to have a different sense of poetry. We start to have a different sound structure dominating poetry. So on that
yeah,
note, there is a question from Anuradha Mazumdar, and she asks this question saying that English is pronounced and spoken differently in different geographical locations. Now, would the lack of awareness of these infra-thin references somehow interfere with the appreciation of the poem?
that's fascinating. That's such a good question. That is so true. All I can say is, I think in most cases, the kinds of things I'm talking about would be true, like "Let us go then, you and I," no matter what the intonation or where. But it's quite true that there would be differences, and that's fine. Then you get a kind of differential text that would be different depending on where it was being read. Now, here's an interesting thing. Ezra Pound, I didn't know this myself till I worked on this book. I didn't realize it. On Pen Sound, I don't know if you know the wonderful, wonderful website that we have at the University of Pennsylvania called Pen Sound, that Al Filreis has up there, Pen Sound. Richard Seaberth has put together all the readings ever that we still have of Ezra Pound. And those are fascinating. And he was a terrific reader. But what's strange is this: when he uses the Chinese ideograms, which of course you see, they're very important on the page and they relate to meaning. He often explains the meaning, but when he reads out loud, he leaves them out. He doesn't have them at all. Now, I don't know if I read them, should one leave them out? I mean, if you know how to pronounce them, which I don't really, but they usually tell you how to pronounce them. He just eliminates them. They're not part of the oral fabric. They're part of the visual fabric. Now, I imagine that when Yunte Wang has now translated many of the cantos into Chinese, and there must be an Indian translation, isn't there, of the cantos? I imagine that the difference in pitch and tone and locution and how differently English is pronounced, yes, it would definitely make a difference, and that would be interesting to talk about, very interesting to talk about, and important. So that's why I said this is not a science of any kind. All you can do is point out things, that strike you in a way, but these things are not scientific. I don't believe that prosody even can be really done scientifically in that sense. And yes, of course, it would make all the difference whether how something perceived and performed. And I'm sure that the same poet Tagore, even in English, is not the same as he would actually seem in his home turf or so on. Yeah.
Marjorie, are you still there to take two more questions? The final two questions.
Sure. The second week. I know, folks. It's 12:15 here tonight.
I know that. So I'm asking you, did you have your afternoon nap today? Yeah. So here is the second question. Second last question, obviously, is from Arnab Chakraborty, and these last two questions are obviously philosophical questions. I think they're springing from Hegel and Wittgenstein. So this question from Arnab is about that he says that Hegel writes about the universality of themes. How important is the conceptual content as mediated by the various experiments with form?
In teams, can you say that again? I don't quite get that. In terms of teams?
Yes. The question that he's asking that the universality of themes, how important is the conceptual content as mediated by the various experiments with form?
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, no conceptual. I think it was Saul Lewitt who said it about conceptual art. No art poetry can be better than the person who does it or the way it's done. So conceptual art, this is true, by the way, of everything, of any collage, any kind of form. No form is better than whoever uses it. And you never should fetishize form too much, a particular form, because people can do, collage was a wonderful form for me, for the wasteland, for all kinds of things, but it's also the form of greeting cards. So, there's nothing so great about that. We have collage and advertising, everything. So on. But I think that with the conceptual, as I say, there has to be a very interesting idea to start with. There have been some brilliant conceptual things, not so many, but there obviously are some, but it's very hard to do because, and I think, for instance, I do think Kenneth Goldsmith, who then got into various trouble for the poem he did, which is, the one poem he did, I won't get into that, on Michael Brown. He did, for instance, a wonderful poem called Traffic, which I talk about in Unoriginal Genius. It's not really a poem. He just takes traffic reports, but the way he skews them, and by the way, they're not just taking them straight, they're always changed in various ways. So I would say that any conceptual work, the concept in terms of themes, everything will depend on how the form works and what is selected and what is left out. What is left out is key. I'm watching, I know this is off the subject, but I'll just say it since it's so late at night for me. There's the most wonderful television series, which I recommend to all of you, which is Le Bureau. It's French, but with English subtitles, about their CIA, their equivalent to the CIA, the DJAS. I'm seeing it now for about the third time, even though it has 15 episodes, because it's brilliant. It's really brilliantly done. It is like a poem in a way. And I was thinking what is so brilliantly done is the cuts, where it doesn't drag out something for too long. And that's true of poetry too. The silences are just as important, right, as the words. What isn't said is important, where something can be overdone or overwritten. So all these things are formal issues. And in terms of spacing too, or in terms of the way it's going to look, the hard thing is to do that, what you're going to put in and what you're going to leave out. And it's very interesting often to talk about that, what somebody often rewriting it might leave out or do an adaptation of it. But anyway, I really, I do think video is one of our big media today. And one thing I like so much about the Brazilian concrete poets is they have taken their early short little concrete poems and transformed them into installations, performances, larger things, so that they show how fruitful that can be. So it doesn't just have to be the lyric poetry on the side here. It can become all kinds of other things. So, and that's part of our culture after all, that it'll morph into different forms. So I think some of the best work is being done in the United States too, by people who are performers and who can perform the work interestingly, and how that works. And so I'm sure you have that here too. And I'm very interested in how all that works digitally too. But I just mean also just in terms of actual performances, or the thing can be turned into an artwork. It can be turned into something else that you perceive a different way. Context is everything. And the way it's contextualized will make a difference. So I really thought to myself, watching this, most of the stuff is so bad that we see on Netflix or whatever. But Le Bureau is a real work of art. And it's interesting seeing it. It's a spy story, the ultimate spy story with double agents. But it is a work of art because of the way it's done, And it's political, quite political. Yeah.
Okay, so the next question is about from Shubhayu Bhattacharya, and he's interested to know how do you actually look at this idea of the differential? Because what he tries to say is that while we are interpreting, most of the time we get into discovering a meaning that has some kind of acceptability or acceptance, a kind of a generally agreed way of understanding a meaning. Say, for instance, once you were reading Westland, then you would know that this is a poem that talks about the post-war period, or talks about the erosion of spirituality and probably the sexual sterility and many other things that come with it. But when one reads that poem, then how would you look at this idea of this differential there in a poem like Westland?
Parts of it, obviously you have to look at the whole. I mean, the Wasteland is so big that you do need everything. You need its sources, you need the background, you need when it was written. But I just came across, for instance, when I talked about translation before, which is one of the main aspects of the kind of thing I'm talking about, there's a book that came out just this year by Jason Harding. It's quite interesting, on non-translation, where he tried to see why poets don't translate and leave it in the original language. But I came across a very strange thing at the very beginning of The Wasteland, when we're in the Hofgarten and you have the woman talking, and she says, you know, I don't remember now the lines exactly. We drank coffee in the Hofgarten and went out and so forth. And Ms. Marie. And then you have in German, bin gar keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt Deutsch. You remember that line? It's right there, which means in English, I'm not Russian. I come from Lithuania, true German. And somebody wrote about that and said, well, you know, that's meant seriously. Now, why did Eliot leave it in? These are the kinds of questions that I would ask about The Wasteland. Once it's already known as a poem, we know the broader, you have to know, of course, the broader things about it too. But what's really interesting to me is that he's so sarcastic there. It's Eliot at his worst and most snobbish. What he's really saying is how mongrelized everybody is since World War II, since World War I, excuse me, that now we have all these people all over the place, Jews and this and that, you know, and so forth. So here's somebody talking, she's not a Russian, she's from Lithuania, but she calls herself echt Deutsch, a true German. She's not a true German. She isn't really German at all. She's just speaking German. So for Eliot, that's an example of all the deracinated people in The Wasteland who don't belong anywhere really. And it's his basic, it's the worst side of Eliot, namely his anti-Semitism, his anti-everything-ism, and so forth. And on that same subject, I've never heard this discussed. It's very interesting that he uses French, German, Italian, Latin, Greek, and finally Sanskrit, right? Finally Sanskrit. But what is the language he never uses, which he should? He has all those things from the Old Testament, but he never uses Hebrew. Now, what does that mean? This is where sociology and the social structure comes in. Obviously, at Oxford or Cambridge in those years, nobody studied Hebrew. That was considered, you know, we have the King James Bible. Why do we need the original Hebrew Bible, right? So everything is quoted from Ezekiel, Elijah, and they're all quoted in English from the King James, Son of Man, thou knowest only, from the King James Bible. And I was once at Oxford recently, and there was somebody in one of the dining things, and I said, why do you think it's not quoted in the original Hebrew? And he got very annoyed and said, well, I mean, it's the King James Bible. But now think about it. That isn't the original language, but he doesn't do that because, of course, that was, again, a kind of snobbery and racism and prejudice. He didn't want to have anything to do with Hebrew, even though those all were originally Hebrew things. So when you start yourself some things that are known well, and you look at the micro-poetics of it, you can often find important social and political things like that I had never thought about in earlier years, but now seems so obvious to me in a way that is the quality. And after all, Eliot does have that enormous handicap and, you know, that incredible snobbery, really racism, and the fear of all the people who were now in the world after World War I who were coming to England. So that's important. Yeah, that's important too. I never mean to say that the historical and political realities aren't important. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, Marjorie, there's a last question, and I don't think we can end a session with Marjorie without some Wittgenstein, because that is so closely connected with your work. So there is a question from Ravish Ratnesh who would like to ask you about where do you see the poetic in Wittgenstein Tractatus for that?
Oh, right. Well, you know, Wittgenstein said, he said later on in the 30s, philosophy can really only be written as a form of poetry, as a form of poetic composition. Die Philosophie sollte man eigentlich nur dichten. And dichten is not quite translatable because dichten could also be to write a novel, you know, whatever it is. But I think the answer there is that I'm working on this right now, that the Tractatus, which began as the ultimate logical treatise, and it does have all that, propositions, what is a proposition? What is a truth proposition? Tautology, representation, it deals with all those issues. And then, and it was written during the war, on the battlefield, often during action, while Wittgenstein was himself about to be shot and then was wounded and so forth. And in the course of the war, when he was writing it, it morphs into something very different. And he starts asking this, saying things like, the sense of the world must lie outside the world, or death is not a part of life, death is not lived through. And out come all these things about life, death, these axioms. But for Wittgenstein, and that's why he's in a way that he wouldn't have liked Duchamp, but he's very much like it. The enemy is generalization. Wittgenstein says there is no theory, there's no meta theory. He's the antithesis of Heidegger that way. That says there is no meta theory, and we don't want theories, we don't want generalizations. Philosophy is basically a practice. It's an activity. It's a practice. You have to learn to ask questions, but there are no answers. There are never answers. There are only questions. And so in a way, it resembles Buddhism, resembles lots of things. But so the last book of the last chapter of the Tractatus is very much this very moving part where these questions get asked, the basic questions of human life. And on the other hand, there are no answers. Wittgenstein would later say there are no ethical generalizations you can make, but there are ethical actions, and we know what they are. But you can't ever generalize completely about them. And so I think that's actually, these are ideas that are very important today and relate to a lot of things in our own culture. That doesn't mean you can't talk about anything, but you have to contextualize it, and you ask questions, and by that you show how these ridiculous answers, like I say, these statements about Asian Americans, are kind of meaningless. And so the Tractatus is a very poetic work, and it's always appealed. Terry Eagleton has a wonderful little essay on the Tractatus. That's how I first got interested in it, how much it appealed to artists, to poets, to composers, to dancers. You know, Jasper Johns was and Cage were very interested in Wittgenstein. Joanna Drucker wrote a little book. She wrote a little book called The Wittgenstein Variations. A woman named Jan Zwicky, who's Canadian, who is a philosopher, who died recently, actually, wrote a wonderful kind of poems based on that. So it and lineage in it. So it has led to a lot of poetry, because it's basically a poetic. The concepts are poetic, namely in that there's indeterminacy. You can never nail things down completely. There's always something slightly that we can't say, that we cannot fully say, that we cannot fully know. You know, wonderful examples he gives. On the other hand, you can't expect certainty. You know, there were the wonderful examples given in On Certainty, where Wittgenstein says things like, if you ask somebody, have you been to India? And the person says, I don't know. Well, what does that mean? I mean, how can you not know? You mean you were in your mother's womb or what? I don't know. So it's ridiculous. In daily life, where he differs from somebody like Derrida, is Wittgenstein would say, in daily life, in our daily discourse, we know exactly what we're saying. If we're native speakers and I say to you, pass the sugar, you know what I'm saying, and you pass the sugar. There's nothing difficult about it at all. But there's always a certain point with words like pain. Let's take the word pain. If I say I have a pain, you don't know if I'm faking. You don't know whether you can't really tell what kind of pain I'm having. You can't ever fully grasp it, right? In communication. And then our basic words are very much like that. Reading, what does it really mean to read? Have I just memorized it and pretending to read? You know, what am I doing? So that these are the kinds of things that are the stuff of poetry, really. Does that answer?
Thank you, Marjorie. That's been quite a powerhouse session that we had for the last 2 hours. There is such a lot of things being discussed, such a lot of things being thrown up, and such a lot of things to think about once the session is over. It's been wonderful talking to you. It's been wonderful and a great honor for the Department of English here to host you. And we look forward to having many more communications, many more collaborations in the days ahead. And thank you again, and thank you very much.
I think the questions were simply wonderful. I've never had such good questions. They were great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And what we can say, obviously, is good night to you now.
Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, going off. How do I get out now, right?